This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the World Wars. The coming of the Great War. Germany had risen as an economic and political rival to Great Britain. This happened in the late 1800s when Germany created the Zollverein. The Zollverein was a free trade zone in Europe that intentionally excluded Great Britain. The reason why Germany did this was that Great Britain had started with the Industrial Revolution. Germany had to catch up in the 1870s and 1880s, and they hoped that by creating the Zollverein, this would exclude Great Britain from being able to do as much free trade, and this would rise Germany's power within Central Europe. Germany then allied with Austria-Hungary and Italy militarily. Britain, however, allied with France and Russia to place a check on the German growth of power in Central Europe. The main causes of World War I. The big causes of World War I included the following. M for militarism, which is a growth of new military technologies, especially, for example, like the automatic Gatling gun. A for alliances. There were two, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. The idea of the alliances was based upon deterrence. No one would attack without causing a war with all of your enemy's allies. So this basically would stop people from attacking and hopefully prevent war. In fact, we use this today all the time. We create alliances like, for example, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Usually this works. However, when you bring in all of these different causes, we ended up leading into a global war. I for imperialism. European countries, ever since about the 1860s, had been competing with each other for colonies in Africa and Asia. And then N, nationalism. Nationalism is not the same as patriotism. Nationalism is an extreme form of patriotism and a belief in your country's superiority over all other countries. The outbreak of World War I. World War I was eventually caused by a major event which was sort of the brink of all the main causes of World War I. And that was when Gavril Princip, who was a member of the Black Hand terrorist group within Serbia, went into Austria and ended up assassinating the Archduke Ferdinand. The reason why had to do with the Austrian takeover of Serbia and the desire amongst the many of the Serbians to gain their independence. Please note, though, that this is not a cause of World War I. It is a symptom of the problem. There's a term that we use in history called overdetermination. Overdetermination means that there is not a single cause that leads to an event, but rather there are so many problems that have led up to an event that at some point there is a tipping point that throws us over into the major effect that is caused by this. In this case, the main causes, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, had grown to such an extent that when Gavril Princip did his assassination, the tipping point was crossed, and at that point we fell into World War I. Austria declared war on Serbia. This triggered Russia to come to the aid of Serbia, and Germany to then come to the aid of Austria. The Schlieffen Plan. Germany decided that they were going to have a quick way to make sure that they could end this war, and this was developed by one of their generals, General Schlieffen. The idea was this. Germany would develop a strategy to quickly attack northern France through neutral Belgium. The purpose was to get France out of the war as quickly as possible and therefore to avoid a two-front war with Russia. Britain declared this as a violation of international law and then declared war on Germany. The context was the German and British battle for leadership over Europe. Britain definitely did declare that this was a violation of international law, but when you really think about it, the real British concern here was the growing power of Germany in Central Europe. Germany operated under a strict monarchy that did have a parliament, but the parliament was more of a rubber stamp for the monarchy. This was very different from the British system of free markets and democracy. So Britain wanted to make sure that Germany would not rise in power in Central Europe, and this basically gave them an excuse or a subtext for them to declare war against Germany. The effects on non-European powers. Britain ended up using recruits from India and South Africa to fight in the war. Germany used recruits from the Ottoman Empire. This is really important because at the time, the Ottoman Empire had been one of the strongest empires in the world for the previous 500 years. But during the 1860s and 1870s, the Ottoman Empire had slowly been falling apart. In fact, the name that was given in Europe for the Ottoman Empire was the Old Sick Man, because the belief was the Ottoman Empire would eventually fall apart, but they wanted it to happen slowly so that no one country could fill in the vacuum too quickly. Within the Ottoman Empire, there was a fight between the Young Turks, who believed that Islam was important, but the religion of Islam should be practiced individually and privately, and traditional imams, who believed that the government should be aligned to the theocracy of Islam. The Young Turks during this war blamed the Armenians for supporting the Russians, and that led to the Armenian genocide in 1915. The U.S. entry into the war. President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, and the basis of his platform was that he would keep the U.S. out of the war. Woodrow Wilson warned Germany against using one of their major technologies in the war at that point, which was the U-boat or submarine warfare. Germany, however, used the U-boat or submarine warfare to attack the Lusitania, a civilian luxury liners. At that point, the U.S. did not get involved in the war. It actually took a few more events for it to take place. One of the biggest events that took place was the U.S. was given a letter that Britain supposedly intercepted between Germany and Mexico. It's called the Zimmermann Note. The Zimmermann Note basically was by the German ambassador Zimmermann and said that if Mexico began attacking the United States, when Germany won, Germany would return all lands taken from Mexico during the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s. Combining this together with the U-boat issue, the U.S. then sent troops into World War I, overwhelming the Germans within the French countryside, and that would eventually lead to the end of the war within about 2 years. At the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson established something called the 14 Points. The 14 Points were meant to be a list of points that would end all possibilities of war in the future. Now, most people who have looked at this laugh, and they laugh because they know that not too long after this we got involved in World War II. Also, they laugh because they see this as kind of a joke. How is it possible that after 10,000 years of human history that we could all of a sudden end all wars, especially after World War I? But this actually misses the point of what Woodrow Wilson was actually after. For example, let's look at the 4 major resolutions of the 14 points that he gave. These 4 are sort of general. The other 10 are actually smaller, detailed resolutions that really aren't that important for us. But here are the big 4. Reduction on the production of arms, free trade over the seas, self-determination and independence for colonies, and the creation of a League of Nations for global diplomacy. Now, how would this stop wars? First of all, it's not going to stop all wars and all conflicts, and Wilson never thought that this would be the case. Wilson was trying to stop global wars, and he believed that the way you could do that would be, number 1, reduce the amount of production of arms. This doesn't mean that nations won't produce any arms, but they will lower the amount that they do, and this way it eases tensions between countries. Open up free trade over the seas. Countries that trade together don't go to war against each other, and we actually see this today. Take, for example, China and the United States. We have 2 opposing ways of doing government, but we probably aren't going to go to war against each other. Why not? Our economies are so interlinked that if either country attacked the other, it would drop both of our economies. Self-determination and independence for colonies. Think about what caused World War I, competition of colonies. If these colonies were self-determined and if they were independent, there would be no need for this competition, and a creation of the League of Nations. Today we have something like the League of Nations. We have the United Nations. It is different, and we'll talk about that later on, but the League of Nations would have been a place in which we could do global diplomacy publicly. This would provide a last option for us to do diplomacy before we would go to war. When you combine all 4 of these together, you can understand what Wilson was actually after in trying to stop future global wars from happening. Causes of World War II. Many people assume that World War II is basically an extension of World War I, very similar in what happened. But actually, the causes of World War II are significantly different. Here's why. World War I was about the production of arms and the competition of colonies. World War II was about an economic catastrophe. The economic catastrophe took place in the 1920s. The stock market in the U.S. had boomed. It created, and this led to new technologies like the dishwasher, refrigerator, electricity, and the radio. Consumer purchasing power grew rapidly during this time as people's wages rose. But then in 1928, there was the Great Depression in the United States. The stock market crashed twice, causing a global depression to take place. When people looking around tried to blame someone, they blamed the democratic governments and capitalism for having done this. So people started to look for alternative governments. Notice the difference here in the cause of World War II. In World War II, an economic catastrophe leads to a vacuum of power and a desire to look for some type of alternative government. And there were only two available, either fascism or communism. The fascist option. The fascist option was developed by Adolf Hitler, but actually was developed by a number of leaders before Adolf Hitler. Hitler joined up with the German National Party. He provided an option of having the government work with industry. They would produce military goods. Now, we all know how monstrous the fascist option became, but what we oftentimes forget is how successful it was at the beginning and attracted people because of its success. While the United States was suffering from anywhere between 19 to 25% unemployment, Adolf Hitler was able to lower the unemployment rate to 2%. Also, he would use secret police that would go out from street corner to street corner, silencing dissenters by either killing them or dragging them into places and beating them into silence. The government also crushed unions, which assured workers' cooperation and less cost of labor. Italian fascism. Italy was divided into a northern business section and southern farming. Mussolini originally was a socialist, but he decided this would not work. So he led a group of people called the Black Shirts, and they marched against the capital. And then he used the Italian military to go out and conquer Ethiopia. In both the cases of Italy and German fascism, the idea was to increase military spending, go out and conquer areas, bring back more resources, and by doing this, lower unemployment. Hitler's rise to power. The first time Hitler tried to rise to power was with the beer push. In this case, Hitler led a bunch of German workers in Munich to march and take over the city, but this failed. He was imprisoned. As he sat in prison and eventually wrote his book, Mein Kampf, he decided that he had gone about this the wrong way. He had tried to take over power through a violent revolution, but this was too easy to undermine because all the country had to do was call out the armed forces to undermine him. So instead, he decided to take a route within the system to take it over. He decided to run for political office. And by doing that, he won the chancellor's seat. He then created a fake emergency crisis by having his own men burn down the Reichstag, but blamed that on the Jews and the communists. He then called for more emergency powers, and once he got those powers, he took full power through the democratic vote. German expansion. At that point, Germany had created a strong centralized governmental system with a strong military production. So the only thing left to do was to expand outwards. Hitler annexed Austria by rigging an election there. He gained British and French approval to take the western half of Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference. And the reason why he was able to do this was that he claimed, correctly so, that the western half of Czechoslovakia had been taken away from Germany after World War I, but still included most ethnic Germans. So he claimed that as long as he got that back, he would stop where he was at. But of course, as we know, that was not his intention. After he got half of Czechoslovakia, he went through the rest of it and then marched north and took over Poland. At that point, France and Britain realized what Hitler was doing and decided to fight him, but it was a little too late. France and Britain were surrounded by Germany, and France was defeated and taken over by the Germans. Hitler's biggest mistake was his invasion of Russia. Hitler wanted to conquer Russia quickly because he knew that if he was able to do this, he would be the first and only leader from the West who was capable of doing that. His generals really didn't agree with him, but they decided to concede this to him as long as he would go through the Balkans, down in the southern part of Europe, to maintain supply lines. The Balkans areas are right by the Mediterranean. It's very warm. It's very easy to maintain supply lines there. But Hitler knew this would take a very long time. He wanted to go through the quickest route possible of Eastern Europe. So what he did was he sent his troops through, and then right behind the troops he sent a group called the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen was a secret German police that would follow the German military, take Jewish people out of their homes in Eastern Europe, and execute them en masse. We tend to know about how horrible the German death camps were in the concentration camps, which is true, they were. But actually far worse was what the Germans did when they marched through Eastern Europe and Russia. They would actually have Jewish people come out of their homes, dig mass graves, and then they would execute them, pushing the bodies into these areas. There were some who did survive. The people who survived, though, survived by basically falling into these ditches before they were shot or only barely shot, and basically covered up by naked, dead members of their own family or communities. They would then have to escape these areas with Germans in the local area and then run through the forests of Eastern Europe and Russia during some of the coldest parts of winter in order to survive. Hitler's forces were only eventually slowed down by the Russian winter and the huge Russian population that simply could not be completely pacified. The Allies' strategy. When the United States got involved in the war, they and Britain together decided upon two strategies. First, they decided upon the idea of Europe first. The Europe first idea was to emphasize Europe before fighting against Japan. Once they could remove Europe from the war, the idea was they would be able to focus their energies upon Japan. In order to win over Europe, they developed a strategy called the Northern African strategy. What they would do is they would invade Europe through Northern Africa to take out Italy. That would isolate Germany and make it much easier to defeat them. The Uneasy Alliance. Joseph Stalin had originally made an alliance with Adolf Hitler called the Non-Aggression Pact. He basically agreed with Hitler that as long as Hitler was allowed to get ready for war and to practice with his troops in Russian territory, Hitler would make sure that he would never invade Russia. But of course, this was never Hitler's intention. So once Stalin found out that Hitler had invaded into Russia, he then joined with the Allies. Stalin believed, however, and this is going to be important for what happens after World War II, Stalin believed that the North African strategy was a strategy not only to win World War II, but was actually a stalling technique by the Allies in order to defeat both communism and fascism. The idea, according to him, was that Hitler would fight against Stalin and weaken Stalin to the point that once Hitler was taken out of the war, Stalin would be so weak that the Allies would be able to take over. There is no proof for this being the case. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill never talked about the possibility of using the North African strategy to eventually defeat Stalin as well. But this was what Stalin believed. It was his paranoia, and it would lead to the eventual problems that we'll see in the Cold War after World War II was done. The end of the war conferences. By the end of the war, there were a series of conferences that took place, and the most important are the Yalta and the Potsdam Conference. The Yalta Conference, Allies agreed to invade Germany. Russia would come from the east, and America and Britain from the west. Europe then would be split into two sections, Western U.S. leadership and Eastern USSR leadership. This is so important because it establishes the problems that are going to happen at the Potsdam Conference. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies agreed that there needed to be an invasion of Japan. But the United States and the Western powers were afraid that they would end up in the same situation that they did in Europe. If Russia came in from the east and America from the west, they would again have to split up Southeast Asia. But they had a way out of this. During the conference, there had been a testing of the atomic bomb, and it had worked. And so because of that, the new president who had come into power when Franklin Roosevelt died, Harry Truman, learned of that success at Los Alamos and came back to the table realizing that Russia was going to enter into the East, and he knew that he could use the atomic bomb as a way to keep them out. This brings up the controversy of why we really dropped the atomic bomb. Was it to end World War II, or was it to intimidate the Russians? The end of the war institutions. At the end of the war, the United States and the other major Allied powers looked to ask the question, why did World War II get started in the first place? Well, unlike World War I, which was started over colonial competition and over arms productions, the idea was the World War II had gotten started because of an economic collapse. And so because of that, there were three institutions established. First, the United Nations, which is a global institution for diplomacy. This is actually the weakest of the three. The two really big powers that most people don't know about are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank is an international institution to provide loans to countries to develop and avoid the Great Depression. The International Monetary Fund provides the conditions or the rules for these loans in order to make sure we maintain free markets. Now notice what's happening here. Unlike the 14 points that tried to develop diplomacy and reduction of arms, what the United States is creating here is a way to manage the global economy so there will never again be a Great Depression and people won't be looking for radical forms of government.